The principles of design. In this particular video, we're going to talk about the principle of contrast and how to apply it to the elements of design. So obviously contrast means extreme opposites, right? Let's turn this off here and move on to our first example. This would be an example of contrast of shape. The contrasting triangle there attracts your attention. Why? Number one, it sticks out, right? So because all of the other ones are square and this one's a triangle, it sticks out, right? So it creates an immediate pull to the eye. So using a contrasting shape, whether it's in a pattern, it's not the only way to use shape, of course, but this is one example how you can use contrast of shape to attract attention. And that's what we're trying to do now is using the elements to attract the viewer's attention and guide them as they look at our design. Next one is going to be a contrast in size. So now there is some color applied to this one here, but we can actually turn off the color there. But we can actually use the principle of size, right? So in this case here, there is a large size and a small size. Now, if you notice, you do actually gravitate to that small triangle. Why? Because the larger shape is much more blocky, whereas the bottom shape is creating some tension because of the angle, and angles create movement. So you see here, whether it's in gray, or in this case, we have a hot and cold contrast, so we'll talk about color later. You're actually able to pull the viewer's attention, and this feels counterintuitive because in Western civilization, we read from the top to the bottom, left to right. In this case, we're going from the top right to the bottom left, which feels counterintuitive. So it can really creates a little bit of tension and movement at the same time. This particular example is contrast in line. So we've got some vibration going on. So if you stare at those lines, you'll notice that basically your eyes start kind of bugging out a little bit because of the negative shapes in between the black line and the curved area there. So the black and white, because of their proximity, is now creating some vibrance and basically creates some tension there. But once you get past that, you do notice the two verticals, right? And we already learned that in direction, that verticals attract more attention than horizontal. So here we've got a couple of ways that we're leveraging contrast to actually create some interest in our piece. Next one is contrast in direction. So here we've got a dominant diagonal direction, but you do notice the horizontal. So a diagonal direction is much more visually interesting, but because we're using the principle of contrast and we have a single horizontal element, okay, it actually the diagonal leads us down to this particular horizontal element and it actually attracts attention to it. Why? There's contrast, right? So the diagonals, even though they're all different colors, there's a principle of repetition, okay, or gradation. So those are becoming a larger unit. So the single unit that stands out, even though the principle of size says smaller should not stand out, in this case, we're using diagonal contrast to make this horizontal element pop out. Okay, the next one here, we're talking about texture. So here we've got a very rough texture here. So once we apply a smooth texture and a rough texture, and we have contrast, even though the smooth texture is much larger, your eye naturally moves to the right. Okay, you've got a dark spot here. It almost looks like an eye. It's red, so it's a warmer color in a field of cool grays. But even though this is a large, smooth area, you see, because of the roughness of the texture, your eye tends to gravitate towards rough texture. In this case, it's warning that is rough. And almost the soft texture becomes almost like something is blurry and you don't want to look at it. You're kind of looking for something for your eye to land on here. So we're using the contrast of texture to create attention and drive the viewer to the right in this case. Next is the principle of color. Okay, so here we are, we've got the principle of color. And in this case, we're using contrast of hot versus cold colors. So we have a red square, even though it's very small, it's in a very predominant spot, typically where you would find the first paragraph on a piece of paper. So it already, because of placement, attracts a lot of attention. But the fact that it's so small and hot or red color, right? It attracts attention. So here we have the principle of contrast of color using hot and cold. So you can see once you get into color, it actually requires two levels of thinking. It's not just contrast of color, There are additional principles, and that's why we're going to spend several weeks looking at color and color theory and how to use color. The next one is contrast of color again, but this is contrast of saturation, or you might see it written as chroma. So on the right side towards the bottom, we see a much more saturated, rich orange, whereas on the left side where we're starting is a much more muted color, right? And if you stare at this, your eye naturally wants to go to the bright, shiny new color, right? Imagine a bright new car and a car that's been sitting out in the desert for years, right? So the new car is just going to attract more attention. So chroma, or the saturation brightness of a color, will attract attention. These are two blues here, and one is a dark value and one is a light value here. So again, dark values tend to recede, light values tend to come forward. In this case, they're both blues, they're both cool, but your eye goes to the brighter color, right? Because value is nothing more than light. So if I convert these to gray here, you can see why. You know, it's a dark room, and here there's a bright opening. So even though it's in color, the value of the color, the natural value of that color, if it's brighter, will attract attention. It creates contrast. Okay. In the next example, we're using yellows. In this case, we're talking a little bit more about a harmonious color theory. So using analogous colors, right? So colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, a yellow and a yellow orange here, creates some contrast. Okay. Whereas if we use a complementary, a yellow and its complement, a purple, it gets a lot more contrasty, right? So colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel are going to have more contrast, okay, and make each other pop more, whereas colors that are next to each other on the color wheel have less contrast. And again, we can take a look at these in gray. You can see the analogous colors, the yellow and the orange, have very little contrast, whereas the yellow and the purple have a lot more natural contrast there. So that's a little bit, it's a high level overview now of how we can start applying the principle of contrast to all of our individual elements. We'll move on to the next principle now.